Hey everyone! Thanks for joining Transit Online today. My name is Paige, and today we're going to be diving into week 2 of this series called The Whole Point. Last week, we talked about what the meaning of our faith is and the whole point around it. This week is all about finding freedom from living from others' approval, whether it be from your parents and siblings, to your friends, everyone around us. We are all consumed with the desire to be liked and approved of by the people in our lives. And so that's why I believe today's message will encourage us to find freedom from this. So let's have a listen.
Hey friends, I am Jessica, and when I was in middle school, there was this one group of girls I really wanted to be friends with. I really wanted them to like me and accept me, and I wanted to sit with them at lunch. But at their lunch table, you had to have one certain kind of lunchbox in order to be allowed to sit there. And if you didn't have that kind of lunchbox and you tried to sit there, they would ask you to leave. And so I asked my dad to buy me this certain kind of lunchbox so that I could sit at their table because I wanted them to like me and accept me. Maybe some of you can relate to this. I think we all know what it feels like to be focused on trying to get someone else to like us. I mean, who doesn't like to feel accepted, supported, and that other people like you? It feels really good when you know other people approve of you. I think if we're being honest, we'd all say that we want to earn the approval of others, especially in places like school or with our friends or at home or even at church. In one way or another, all of us want to feel accepted by others. And that's because whether we realize it or not, approval matters to all of us. See, there are all kinds of people that we're trying to get approval from in our lives. Your friends at school, your parents, step-parents, guardians, your siblings, your coaches, your teachers, even God. Honestly, the list could go on and on. In one way or another, we're all working toward the approval of someone else. And while there's nothing wrong with wanting to be liked or have someone be proud of you, the problem comes when we make their approval the whole point. Think about it. Trying to get the approval from our parent or our coaches, our teachers, our siblings, our friends, our group at church, and even God? Well, it's really exhausting. When we work so hard for the approval of others, how do we feel at the end of the day? Well, in my experience, we just feel worn out. And I think that's because first, it never works. There are just some people in your life who will never make you feel like you're enough. You'll never be able to do enough or say enough or be enough of what they want you to be. No matter how hard you work to gain their approval, they aren't going to give it. And that's just plain exhausting. Then it's easy to lose. Approval is kind of funny that way. One day you may have it from someone and the next day it's gone. There's no reason for it, but when that praise and affirmation is suddenly gone, you've got to start all over again to try and get it back. Then sometimes it feels like pressure. There are some people in your life who want you to want their approval. In fact, they do whatever they can to put pressure on you to try and earn it. And not only is that super unhealthy, it's always impossible to keep up with. And finally, it's hard to know when we have it. Think about it. How do we ever really know when we have the full approval of someone else? Our parents or guardians, our coaches, even God. How can we ever be sure we're fully accepted and supported? Honestly, we can't. So we just keep working and working toward it until we're worn down and exhausted. When you look at it this way, this search for approval feels like it never ends. Sometimes it even feels like part of our faith. Are we supposed to be working to earn God's approval all the time too? Do we feel like we're constantly trying to prove ourselves to our group at church? Honestly, it feels like a lot. And that has to make you wonder, is this really the whole point? Today, we're looking at a letter that was written by a guy named Paul to encourage new believers in a community called Galatia. This letter, called Galatians, is recorded in the Bible. Paul actually started the church in Galatia, but shortly after that, he left the Galatians to go on to a new place. But when he did, other teachers who were false teachers showed up behind him. These guys started telling the new Christians in Galatia something totally different than what Paul had taught. They told the people that in order to actually be a Christian, they had to follow the Jewish laws. Of course, this wasn't true at all, but the new believers needed a reminder of that. They needed help remembering that having faith in Jesus didn't require anything of them. They didn't have to do anything to earn God's love or be accepted into God's family. Their faith in Jesus was enough, and Paul wrote his letter to remind them of just that. point. You see, these false teachers weren't big fans of Paul. In fact, they were busy telling the Galatians not to listen to him. They wanted to convince the people that Paul was only telling them about freedom in their faith in order to please them, that he was just trying to make this whole faith thing easy on them. In other words, he was trying to gain their approval. Rather than let the Galatians believe that was true, Paul responded in his letter. And I think what he said can actually help us when it comes to understanding this whole idea of approval. Here's what Paul wrote. Am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. So basically, Paul said that there were two options when it comes to approval: other people or God. We can either spend our time trying to earn other people's approval, or we can choose to focus on God. Which one is the point? Well, Paul went on to explain. You see, he followed up by saying that when we choose to please others, or when we choose to make the approval of others the whole point, we aren't living the way God calls us to live. In other words, we're focusing on the wrong thing. Paul himself was a great example of how this works. He wasn't afraid to let the Galatians know this false teaching they were following was wrong, and he straight up told them so. Why? Because he wasn't looking for their approval. He didn't feel pressured to act a certain way or talk a certain way or live a certain way just to have them approve. Now, let me stop here and say this. Paul wasn't giving us permission to say whatever we want to anyone at any time just because we think it's right. Notice how Paul spoke to the Galatians. It wasn't rude or harsh or without kindness. He was honest, but not without love. Yes, the people in Galatia mattered to Paul, but their approval didn't matter more to him than God's approval. Because of Jesus, Paul knew he already had that for eternity. See, what Paul demonstrated was this: knowing Jesus changes everything, including the way we understand approval. Because of Jesus, we are free from trying to gain the approval of others. And we're also free from trying to gain God's approval. Thanks to Jesus, we already have it. Because of that, we can focus simply on what God thinks of us. Not because we have to, but because we want to. Because we know that God loves us, wants what's best for us, and will lead us toward what's true. Because we know that what God thinks matters most. In fact, what God thinks about us is really the whole point. When it comes to approval, it's the only kind we need to be concerned with. And the best part? God's approval is already ours. We have God's approval for who we are, just as we are. There's nothing we can do to earn it or change it or even lose it. We just have to believe and follow. Those are the rules of freedom. That's the whole point. Listen, I know that this can feel really difficult to do. It feels like there are people asking you to be a certain way or do certain things or live a certain way in order to be accepted. And like we said before, that can be incredibly exhausting. That's why this truth from Paul is so important. Because at the end of the day, what God thinks matters most. And when you remember that, you're free from the pressure and stress and exhaustion of trying to earn approval from anyone or anywhere else. So if you want to find the freedom God offers us from the approval of others, let's start here. First, figure out where you're looking for approval. Who are the people you're looking for acceptance from? Think about who you're constantly performing for or feel like you need to change something about yourself for. Figure out whose approval you're making the point of your life right now. Then, remember what God thinks about you. What God thinks matters most. So, if we want to be free from chasing the approval of others, we've got to live like we already have God's approval. We've got to know what God actually thinks about us. So, start there. Maybe that means spending less time with the people who pressure you to be something you're not. Or maybe you need to stop scrolling on social media or following YouTube channels that lead you to believe you need to change something about yourself to be accepted. Ask God to help you believe what's true about you. Look up passages of scripture that tell you what God really thinks. Talk to your small group leader about who God says you are. Get to know what God thinks about you so you can go forward knowing God already loves you, approves of you, and wants to be close to you no matter what. Remember, what God thinks matters most. And I want to encourage you today to talk to your group about what God thinks about you. Groups are a great place to discover new things that grow and challenge our faith. They're the perfect place to ask questions and learn more about who God is and what God thinks about you. Your group and your group leader want to be the people who remind you of these things too. So dive into this conversation with people you trust.
Thanks guys for listening. How encouraging is it to hear that because of Jesus, we are free from trying to gain the approval from others and God? God already loves us, wants what's best for us, and will lead us toward what's true. Well, that's it from me today, guys. I hope you found this message super encouraging. Stay tuned for week 3 and stay safe, and we'll see you soon.